What compels a man to forsake the comforts of life, to dedicate every breath of his existence to serving the poorest of the poor, the most forgotten among us? The answer lies in the extraordinary life of Saint Vincent de Paul, the French priest who revolutionized Christian charity in the 17th century. His story teaches us that holiness isn't about escaping the world, but about transforming it with the love of Christ, especially through caring for those whom society prefers to ignore. Chapter 1. The early years in Pouilly. In a small village in the Landes region of southwestern France, around 1581, a child was born who would forever change the history of Christian charity. Vincent de Paul came into the world within a humble yet deeply Christian farming family. His father, William de Paul, worked as a farmer and pig breeder, while his mother, Bertha de Moras, devoted herself to caring for the family homestead and providing a Christian upbringing for their 6 children. The family homestead, though modest, was filled with the fear of God and the love for one's neighbor that would characterize the future saint's entire life. From a very young age, Vincent demonstrated exceptional intelligence and a natural inclination towards spiritual matters. His parents, recognizing these gifts, made great sacrifices to provide him with an education that was beyond their financial means. The boy was first sent to the school in Dax, where the Franciscans ran a college with a good reputation. There, Vincent not only excelled in his studies, but also began to show that special sensitivity towards those in need that would remain with him throughout his life. His classmates would later recall how he shared his food with the poorest students and how he managed to help those who had difficulties with their studies. At the age of 15, Vincent moved to Toulouse to begin his ecclesiastical studies at the university. The decision to embrace the priesthood had not been easy for him, as he wavered between a sincere desire to serve God and the natural aspirations of an intelligent young man who saw the priesthood as an opportunity for social advancement. This inner tension would be a constant in the early years of his priesthood, until divine providence completely transformed his motivations. In Toulouse, Vincent distinguished himself as a diligent and serious student, quickly earning the trust of his professors, who entrusted him with the task of tutoring younger students to help with his educational expenses. The education Vincent received in Toulouse was solid. In both theology and canon law, his professors were learned men who had drawn from the purest sources of Catholic tradition, especially from St. Thomas Aquinas. Vincent eagerly absorbed this knowledge, but above all, he became imbued with the spirit of the Catholic Church in its deepest understanding, the intimate union between faith and charity, between contemplation and action. The seminary years were also a time of inner purification, where the young man learned to discern between his own ambitions and the will of God. On September 23rd, 1600, Vincent de Paul was ordained a priest by the Bishop of Périgueux, Francis de Bourdeille. He was barely 19 years old, a young age even by the standards of the time. The ordination ceremony was simple but deeply significant. When the bishop laid his hands on him, Vincent felt with clarity for the first time the weight of the responsibility he was assuming, to be another Christ to the world, especially to the poorest and most abandoned. However, the full understanding of what this meant would come only after years of experiences that divine providence had prepared to forge in him the heart of the Father of the poor. Chapter 2. The captivity that transformed his soul. The early years of the 17th century brought an experience to Vincent de Paul's life that would profoundly mark his soul and his future ministry. After completing his studies and unsuccessfully attempting to recover an inheritance that had been bequeathed to him by a noblewoman, Vincent decided to take a sea voyage from Marseille to Narbonne. It was the year 1605, and the waters of the Mediterranean were infested with Barbary pirates. who captured Christians to sell them as slaves in the markets of North Africa. The young priest, trusting in divine providence, did not imagine that he was about to live an experience that would bring him closer than ever before to the mystery of human suffering. The pirates attacked the vessel on which Vincent was traveling, and after a fierce battle in which the ship's captain was killed and several passengers were injured, the survivors were taken prisoner. Among them was our saint, who received an arrow wound that would leave a permanent scar. The captives were transported to Tunis, where they were sold in the slave market as if they were animals. Vincent experienced firsthand the deepest humiliation a human being can suffer, being treated as merchandise, stripped of their dignity and their freedom. During the 2 years of his captivity, Vincent passed through the hands of several masters. The first was a fisherman, a rough and cruel man who forced him to work in inhuman conditions. Under the scorching sun of the African desert, the young priest learned what thirst, hunger, and extreme physical exhaustion meant. But it was precisely in this extreme situation that he began to discover a new dimension of his faith. In moments of great suffering, when it seemed that his strength was failing him, Vincent found in prayer an inexhaustible source of comfort and hope. He began to understand that pain, when united with that of Christ on the cross, acquires a redemptive value. His second master was a renegade alchemist, a Christian who had renounced his faith to embrace Islam. This man, although less physically cruel, represented a greater spiritual danger for Vincent. He constantly tried to convince him to abandon his Christian faith, promising him riches and comforts if he converted to Islam. Vincent heroically resisted these temptations, but the daily coexistence with the renegade allowed him to understand the terrible spiritual tragedy of those who abandon the faith. This experience awakened in him a deep compassion for all those who, due to weakness or adverse circumstances, turn away from the truth of Christ. Vincent's third and final master was a more benevolent man, and it was precisely through him that his liberation came about. The wife of this man, who had been Christian before her forced conversion to Islam, was deeply moved upon hearing St. Vincent de Paul sing the psalm Super Flumina Babylonis and other liturgical chants from his homeland. Those sacred melodies awakened in her a longing for her lost faith and a burning desire to return to Christ. She convinced her husband to free Vincent and flee with them back to Christian lands. In 1607, after a perilous escape by boat, Vincent regained his freedom and once again set foot on French soil. But he was no longer the same man who had left 2 years prior. The captivity had purified his soul and awakened in him a visceral understanding of human suffering that would be the foundation of all his future work. Chapter 3. The Encounter with Divine Mercy. Saint Vincent de Paul's return to France marked the beginning of a period of intense spiritual seeking and inner transformation. Having experienced slavery and suffering firsthand, the young priest settled in Paris, intending to continue his studies and find his place within the ecclesiastical structure of the time. However, his first years in the French capital were marked by a certain inner turmoil and the temptation to seek the honors and benefits that the clerical world could offer. Vincent moved among the Parisian aristocratic circles, cultivating relationships that might be useful for his ecclesiastical career, but deep within his soul, a restlessness grew, one he couldn't quite quell. During these years of apparent worldly success, Vincent experienced a profound spiritual crisis, which he himself would later describe as temptations against faith. For several years, the saint struggled against terrible doubts that assailed him, especially during the celebration of Holy Mass. These inner trials, which spiritual masters know well as part of the path to holiness, were for Vincent a true dark night of the soul. However, Instead of giving in to discouragement, the saint adopted a strategy that revealed his profound spiritual wisdom. He would make an act of faith each time doubt assailed him and consecrate his life completely to the service of the poor, as an expression of his love for God. The definitive turning point in Vincent's life came through his encounter with Father Michael Sullivan, founder of the French Oratory and one of the most important figures of the Catholic spiritual renaissance in France. Father Sullivan, who had met Vincent through aristocratic circles, was able to discern beneath the young priest's worldly appearances the special call that God had placed upon him. It was Father Sullivan who guided Vincent spiritually and who helped him understand that his true vocation lay not in ecclesiastical honors, but in direct service to those most in need. Under the spiritual direction of this holy priest, Vincent began to experience an inner peace that he had not known since his youth. The decisive moment of this spiritual transformation occurred when Vincent was appointed pastor of Harmony Creek, a small rural parish near Paris. For the first time in his priestly life, the saint had the opportunity to exercise direct pastoral ministry with simple, hard-working people. In Harmony Creek, Vincent rediscovered the beauty of authentic priestly life, celebrating the Eucharist with devotion, preaching the gospel with simplicity, visiting the sick, consoling the afflicted, and teaching catechism to the children. Those months in the small parish were like a prolonged spiritual retreat that definitively purified Vincent's heart and prepared him for the great mission that God had reserved for him. It was also during this period that Vincent experienced a mystical event, which he himself would later narrate with great reserve and humility. One night, while praying in the church after having heard confessions from several parishioners, Vincent experienced a special presence of our Lord Jesus Christ, who revealed to him what his specific mission in the church would be. Christ showed him how his own heart burned with love for the poor and abandoned, and entrusted him to be his special representative among the most needy in society. This mystical experience, far from filling him with spiritual pride, plunged him into a profound humility and an ardent desire to dedicate himself completely to the service of others. From that moment on, Saint Vincent de Paul would never doubt what his vocation was: to be a priest of the poor and a father of the abandoned. Chapter 4. Pastor of the Abandoned. In 1612, divine providence led Saint Vincent de Paul to a small town called Willow Creek in the region of Bresse, where he would be appointed pastor. This rural parish, inhabited by simple but deeply religious farmers, would become the laboratory where Vincent would develop the model of pastoral care that would revolutionize the practice of Christian charity. Upon arriving in Willow Creek, the saint found a Christian community that had preserved the faith despite economic hardship and a certain spiritual neglect. The inhabitants were hard-working and honest people, but they needed a pastor who would guide them with love and wisdom towards a deeper understanding of the gospel. Vincent dedicated himself with apostolic fervor to the task of spiritually renewing his parish. His first actions were to organize the catechism for children and young people, establish a regular Sunday preaching program, and encourage the frequent practice of the sacraments. But what most impressed his parishioners was the simplicity and approachability with which their new pastor related to them. Vincent regularly visited all the houses in the parish, knew each of the families by name, and took a sincere interest in their problems and needs. This pastoral closeness, which today we might consider normal, was quite exceptional in a time when many clerics maintained a certain distance from their parishioners. The event that would definitely mark Vincent's parish ministry occurred one Sunday morning after Mass. A kind woman approached the saint to tell him about the dramatic situation of a family living on a farm far from the town. The father was seriously ill. The mother had just given birth and didn't have the strength to get up, and the young children had nothing to eat. Vincent, moved by this story, interrupted his afternoon sermon to ask his parishioners to help this needy family. The response was immediate and generous. The entire parish mobilized to help the poor farmers. However, when St. Vincent arrived at the farm, accompanied by several parishioners, he encountered a scene that moved him deeply, but also made him reflect on the effectiveness of spontaneous charity. The family had received so many visits and so much food that some of it had gone to waste, while other families in equal need had received no help at all. This experience was a revelation for St. Vincent. Christian charity, however generous, needed to be organized and systematic to be truly effective. The spontaneous impulse of compassion wasn't enough. It was necessary to create stable structures that would guarantee constant and well-distributed aid. Inspired by this realization, St. Vincent founded the first Confraternity of Charity in Châtillon, an association of Christian women committed to caring for the sick and needy of the parish in an organized manner. The confraternity had simple but precise rules. Each day, 2 ladies were responsible for visiting the sick, bringing them hot meals, cleaning their homes if needed, and providing them with spiritual assistance. St. Vincent personally drafted the rules of the confraternity, establishing a system of shifts that ensured no sick person was abandoned and that no member was overburdened. This seemingly simple organization already contained, in embryo, all the principles that would later guide the great Vincentian works of charity, personal closeness, efficient organization, participation of lay people, and comprehensive attention to both the material and spiritual needs of the poor. Chapter 5. The Gondi Family and the Missionary Awakening. In 1613, St. Vincent de Paul's life took a providential turn when he was appointed chaplain to the distinguished Gondi family. Bartholomew Gondi was a general of the royal galleys of France, while his wife, Eleanor de Silly, belonged to one of the noblest families in the kingdom. The Gondis needed a chaplain to take charge of the religious education of their children and the spiritual care of their numerous servants. St. Vincent accepted this position with some reluctance, fearing that life in a noble household would distract him from his vocation to serve the poor. However, divine providence had prepared paths that the saint could not have imagined. Mrs. Gondi turned out to be a woman of profound piety and great social awareness. She had observed the deplorable conditions in which the peasants on her vast estates lived, and felt responsible before God for the salvation of their souls. Eleanor found in St. Vincent not only a learned and virtuous chaplain, but a fellow apostle who shared her concern for the most needy. Together, they began to regularly visit the villages on the Gondis' lands, where St. Vincent preached popular missions and Eleanor organized charitable works. These missionary experiences in the French countryside opened St. Vincent's eyes to a reality that shocked him deeply: the spiritual abandonment in which the common people lived. The decisive moment of this stage came when St. Vincent was called to spiritually assist a dying peasant in the village of Gannes. The man, seemingly pious and respected by all, confessed to St. Vincent that throughout his life he had been committing sacrileges by receiving the sacraments without ever having confessed certain serious sins that tormented him. This general confession, made in the presence of Mrs. Gondi, revealed to the saint the spiritual tragedy hidden behind the appearances of popular religiosity. How many souls were condemned because they did not have access to a clear preaching of the gospel and a good sacramental confession? This question stuck like a thorn in St. Vincent's heart and became the driving force of his future apostolic zeal. Moved by this event, Mrs. Gondi asked St. Vincent to preach a general mission in Gannes to properly instruct all the peasants of the village. The success of this mission was extraordinary. Hundreds of people came to listen to the saint's preaching and to make general confessions of their entire lives. St. Vincent had to call on several Jesuit priests to help him attend to so many penitents. The spiritual fruit of those days was so abundant that the urgent need to organize this type of popular missions in a stable manner in all the rural regions of France became evident. The missionary experience of Gand marked the birth of St. Vincent de Paul's specific vocation. He had discovered that God was calling him to be an evangelizer of the poor in the countryside, of that immense mass of simple Christians who did not have access to preaching adapted to their condition and needs. The great preachers of the time mainly addressed the educated urban elites, while the common people remained largely spiritually abandoned. St. Vincent understood that his mission was to fill this void, creating a body of missionaries especially dedicated to the evangelization of the peasants. This apostolic project, which was still only a dream in the saint's mind, would become reality a few years later with the founding of the Congregation of the Mission. But first, divine providence had prepared other experiences for St. Vincent that would complete his formation as an apostle of the poor. Chapter 6. Founder of the Congregation of the Mission. April 17th, 1625, marks a historical date in the life of the Catholic Church. The official founding of the Congregation of the Mission by St. Vincent de Paul. After years of spiritual maturation and apostolic experience, the saint had come to the conclusion that it was necessary to create a community of priests specifically dedicated to the evangelization of the poor in the countryside. The idea had come from conversations with Mrs. Gondi, who, deeply impressed by the success of the popular missions, had decided to dedicate a considerable sum of money to found a congregation that would be exclusively dedicated to this work. St. Vincent, with his characteristic prudence, had spent years reflecting and praying on this project before putting it into practice. The Congregation of the Mission was born with very particular characteristics that distinguished it from other religious orders of the time. The members were not monks who lived withdrawn from the world, but secular priests who took simple vows and dedicated themselves completely to active apostolate. Their specific field of work was the spiritually abandoned rural areas where ordinary pastoral structures did not reach effectively. The Vincentian missionaries were known for their austere lives, their simple and direct preaching, and their special affection for the farmers and field workers. St. Vincent understood that to effectively evangelize the poor, it was necessary to adopt their lifestyle and speak to them in a language they could understand. The first superior general of the congregation was, naturally, St. Vincent de Paul himself, who assumed this responsibility with great humility and a sense of service. The first companions who joined the saint were priests of proven virtue and apostolic zeal, drawn by Vincent's special charisma and by the beauty of the mission proposed to them. Among them, Antonio Portale stood out especially, a priest of profound spirituality who would become Vincent's right-hand man and one of the fundamental pillars of the new congregation. Together, they established the foundations of Vincentian missionary formation, which combined solid theological studies with an intense spiritual life and practical training in the arts of popular preaching. The mother house of the congregation was established at the Priory of St. Lazarus in Paris, from which the popular name Lazarists would be derived, by which the Vincentian missionaries would be known. St. Lazarus soon became a center of apostolic outreach, from which groups of missionaries constantly departed for the most neglected regions of France. Vincent meticulously organized the missionary work. Each mission lasted between 2 and 3 weeks, during which the priests preached in the mornings and evenings, heard confessions individually and communally, taught catechism to the children, and organized charitable works for those most in need. At the end of each mission, a confraternity of charity was established to guarantee the continuity of the spiritual fruits obtained. The success of the popular missions was extraordinary from the beginning. The peasants, hungry for a word from God that truly reached their hearts, responded with enthusiasm to the preaching of the Lazarists. Vincent had trained his missionaries in a preaching style that avoided complicated rhetoric and the erudite references that characterized many preachers of the time. Vincentian sermons were simple, direct, full of examples taken from everyday life, and focused on the fundamental truths of the Christian faith. This methodology, revolutionary for its time, would prove enormously effective in reaching the soul of the simple people. Over the years, the congregation of the mission would spread throughout France and later throughout the entire world, always carrying with it the spirit of its founder, the preferential love for the poor, and the total dedication to the service of the gospel. Chapter 7. Saint Louise de Marillac, a collaborator chosen by God. In 1625, divine providence arranged the meeting between Saint Vincent de Paul and Saint Louise de Marillac, a noble Parisian widow, 34 years old, who had consecrated her life to the service of God after becoming a young widow. Louise was a woman of refined education and profound piety, who, despite dedicating herself discreetly to charitable works among the common people, had not found the right channel to focus her ardent desire to serve the Lord in those most in need. When she met Vincent, both experienced that inner certainty that accompanies encounters arranged by divine providence. Vincent immediately recognized in Louise the exceptional qualities he needed to organize the women's charitable works, practical intelligence, spiritual sensitivity, and, above all, a truly maternal heart toward the poor. The collaboration began gradually, with Vincent entrusting Louise with simple tasks related to the confraternities of charity established in Paris. Louise demonstrated not only organizational competence, but a spiritual depth that impressed the saint. She was an authentic mystic who had found Christ in the face of the poor and lived charity as a true path to sanctification. Louise's specific charisma was revealed when Vincent entrusted her with the visitation of the rural confraternities. During these apostolic journeys, she demonstrated an extraordinary ability to discern problems and propose effective solutions. Her reports to Vincent were models of precision, but also revealed a deep understanding of human psychology and spiritual needs. Vincent found in her not only a competent collaborator, but an authentic companion in the apostolate, who fully shared his vision of Christian charity. The spiritual relationship between the two saints became one of the most fruitful collaborations in the history of the Church. Vincent acted as Louise's spiritual director with paternal wisdom, while she responded with admirable docility and apostolic creativity that enriched the common works. Their letters, preserved in great number, reveal the depth of this spiritual direction and mutual trust. Vincent entrusted Louise with ever-increasing responsibilities, recognizing her exceptional qualities, without hesitating to harness her talent for the good of the poor. The culmination of this collaboration came when Vincent entrusted Louise with the formation of young women from farming backgrounds who wished to consecrate themselves to the service of the poor. These young women had a special vocation that did not find an outlet in the contemplative orders of the time. Vincent and Louise understood that God was raising up a new form of consecrated female life, adapted to the times and oriented toward charitable service. Under Louise's direction, this group would become the Daughters of Charity, a congregation that would revolutionize female religious life and would spread throughout the world as a living testimony of organized and effective Christian charity. Chapter 8. The Daughters of Charity, Angels of Mercy. On November 29, 1633, in the modest house that Saint Louise de Marillac inhabited in Paris, 4 young women from farming families met for the first time, Having responded to God's special call to consecrate themselves to the service of the poor, this date marks the official birth of the Company of the Daughters of Charity, a congregation that would forever revolutionize the concept of female religious life, and that would become one of the most beautiful works of Saint Vincent de Paul's charitable genius. Those first young women, simple but generous, could not imagine that they were initiating a way of life that would spread throughout the world and that would endure through the centuries. The originality of the Daughters of Charity lay in the fact that they were not nuns in the traditional canonical sense of the time. They didn't dwell in secluded convents, they didn't wear solemn habits, nor did they take perpetual vows. Their convent was the streets of the cities, their cloister the hospitals and homes of the poor, their choir the groans of the sick. St. Vincent de Paul geniusly understood that to serve the poor effectively, it was necessary to create a new kind of consecrated life, one that combined total devotion to God with the freedom necessary for active ministry. The Daughters of Charity took annual vows of poverty, chastity, obedience, and service to the poor, renewing them each year to keep alive the awareness of their free and generous dedication. The spirit of the Daughters of Charity was perfectly defined in the words St. Vincent directed to the first sisters. Your monastery will be the house of the sick, your cell a rented room, your chapel the parish church, your cloister the streets of the city, or the hospital wards, your enclosure obedience, your habit modesty, and your grill the holy fear of God. These words, which may seem paradoxical, expressed a profound intuition about the demands of Christian charity in the modern world. The poor needed to be served where they were found, in their own environments, with full dedication, but without the barriers that traditional forms of religious life could impose. The formation of the Daughters of Charity was carefully supervised by Sainte Louise de Marillac, who became the first superior and the true spiritual mother of the new community. Louise had learned from Saint Vincent that effective charity needed to combine supernatural love for the poor with the technical competence necessary to serve them adequately. Therefore, the sisters received a complete education, including knowledge of nursing, teaching, domestic administration, and accounting, in addition to a solid spiritual formation centered on devotion to Christ, present in the poor. This comprehensive preparation enabled them to take charge of hospitals, orphanages, schools for poor girls, and all kinds of charitable works. The growth of the company was extraordinarily rapid. In a few years, hundreds of young women from all over France felt drawn to this new form of consecrated life, which allowed them to unite total devotion to God with direct service to those most in need. Saint Vincent and Louise had responded to a profound need of their time: the call of many Christian women to participate actively in the evangelizing work of the Church. The Daughters of Charity spread quickly throughout France, taking charge of hospitals, hospices, orphanages, and schools. Their presence was especially requested in times of epidemics, wars, or public calamities, where their charitable heroism became legendary. These simple women, who had given up forming their own families, became universal mothers of all the destitute, bringing everywhere the maternal love of the Church towards its most needy children. Chapter 9. The Confraternities of Charity and the Revolution of Love. One of the most genial intuitions of Saint Vincent de Paul was understanding that the transformation of society through Christian charity could not be the exclusive work of the clergy and consecrated souls, but required the active participation of all the faithful, especially those who enjoyed a higher social position. The confraternities of charity, which the saint had begun to organize since his time as pastor in Châtillon, became the privileged instrument to channel the apostolic zeal of the laity and to create a true network of Christian solidarity that encompassed all of French society. Saint Vincent had observed that many people of goodwill wanted to help the poor, but did not know how to do it in an effective and persevering way. The confraternities were mainly composed of ladies from the nobility and the Parisian bourgeoisie, who, under the spiritual direction of Saint Vincent, committed themselves to personally serving the poor of their parishes. It was not simply a matter of giving alms, but of establishing a personal and direct relationship with the needy. The members regularly visited the sick in their homes, brought them hot food, cleaned their houses, cared for their children, and ensured that they received the necessary spiritual assistance. Saint Vincent understood that this personal proximity was essential for charity to be truly Christian, and not reduced to mere humanitarian philanthropy. Among the most prominent members were some of the most influential ladies of the French aristocracy. The Duchess of Aiguillon, niece of Cardinal Richelieu, put her fortune and influence at the service of Vincentian works. Madame Gousseau, lady-in-waiting to Queen Anne of Austria, became one of Saint Vincent's most effective collaborators in organizing Parisian charity. The Marchioness of Meignelay, the Countess of Laval, and many other ladies of high society found in the works of Saint Vincent a suitable channel to live their Christian faith authentically. The saint knew how to wisely take advantage of the social position and economic resources of these generous women, directing them towards the common good and the glory of God. The organization of the confraternities was meticulous and effective. Saint Vincent personally drafted the regulations to be followed, establishing a system of shifts that guaranteed constant attention to the needy, without overloading any member. Each confraternity had a president, a treasurer, and several officials who were responsible for coordinating the different aspects of charitable work. Detailed records were kept of all the families assisted, so that none were forgotten, and none received duplicated help. The periodic meetings served to evaluate the work done, plan new initiatives, and keep alive the supernatural spirit that should animate all charitable activity. The most admirable thing about the confraternities of charity was that they managed to transform spiritually both those who gave and those who received. The aristocratic ladies who participated in them experienced a profound conversion that distanced them from worldly vanities and brought them closer to the heart of Christ. At the same time, the poor who were cared for by the members did not feel humiliated by receiving help, but experienced the love of God. Through the sincere and respectful affection with which they were treated, Saint Vincent had managed to create a model of charity that dignified both the giver and the receiver, overcoming social barriers and creating authentic fraternal relationships between people of different social classes. This revolution of love, silent yet profound, contributed more than any political reform to transforming French society at the time and paved the way for a more evangelical understanding of social relationships. Chapter 10. Missionary to the galley slaves and liberator of captives. Among all the works of mercy that St. Vincent de Paul performed, few reveal the universality of his charity as clearly as his ministry among the galley slaves and his work for the redemption of Christian captives in Muslim lands. These two activities, seemingly different, had in common the fact that they were directed towards people in the most extreme situations of human suffering. The galley convicts, considered the scum of society, and the Christian slaves in North Africa, completely abandoned to their fate. Vincent, having personally experienced slavery during his captivity in Tunis, felt a special compassion for all those deprived of liberty. His ministry with the galley slaves began when he was appointed Chaplain General of the Royal Galleys of France, a position he held for many years with extraordinary apostolic zeal. Galleys were warships powered by oars, worked by both slaves and those convicted by the justice system. Living conditions on these ships were absolutely inhumane. The men remained chained for months, sleeping on the benches where they rowed, eating rotten food, and suffering all kinds of abuse from the officers. Vincent became the comforting angel of these unfortunates, visiting them regularly, providing them with food and medicine, and above all, bringing them the word of God and the hope of eternal salvation. The saint didn't limit himself to occasional visits, but organized a truly systematic apostolate among the galley slaves. He established a house for the Lazarist missionaries in Marseille, the main port for the galleys, who dedicated themselves exclusively to the spiritual care of the convicts. These priests regularly celebrated Holy Mass in the galleys, preached sermons adapted to the mindset of those rough men, heard their confessions, and prepared them for a good death when their health failed due to forced labor. Vincent understood that many of those unfortunate men had turned to crime due to misery and lack of Christian education, and he sought to awaken repentance in them and hope in divine mercy. Parallel to his work with the galley slaves, Vincent developed intense activity for the redemption of Christian captives in North Africa. His own experience of captivity had made him especially sensitive to this problem, which affected thousands of European Christians captured by the Barbary pirates. Vincent organized a veritable network of agents in Tunis, Algiers, and other cities of the Maghreb, who were responsible for negotiating the ransom of the captives and for assisting them spiritually while they remained in slavery. To finance these rescue operations, the saint assiduously begged for alms among the wealthy families of France, explaining that redeeming captives was one of the works of mercy most pleasing to God. The Lazarist missionaries that Vincent sent to North Africa constantly risked their lives to keep the faith of the Christian captives alive and to prevent them from apostatizing under the pressures of their Muslim masters. Some of these heroic missionaries were martyred for their fidelity to Christ, becoming the glory of the congregation of the mission. Vincent maintained regular correspondence with his envoys in Muslim lands, guiding them spiritually and providing the necessary resources for their mission. Through this missionary network, the saint managed to rescue hundreds of Christian captives and keep alive the faith of many others who could not be freed. This work of redeeming captives, less known than other Vincentian activities, reveals, however, the truly universal dimension of the heart of the Father of the Poor, which knew no geographical borders or cultural barriers when it came to helping those in need. Chapter 11. The Last Years and the Crown of Sanctity. The last years of St. Vincent de Paul's life were marked by physical suffering and by an ever-increasing spiritual fruitfulness. From 1650 onwards, when the saint had already reached the age of 70, his health began to decline noticeably. His legs, swollen by decades of apostolic walking, could barely support him, and the ulcers that covered them caused constant pain, which he endured with admirable patience. However, far from diminishing his activity, Vincent seemed to multiply his efforts, as if sensing that the time he had left was precious and should not be wasted even for a single moment in the service of the poor. During these years, the saint had the consolation of seeing how all his works had reached a solidity and an extent that guaranteed their endurance. The congregation of the mission already had hundreds of members distributed throughout France, Italy, Poland, and other European nations. The Daughters of Charity, under the wise direction of Sainte Louise de Marillac, had multiplied extraordinarily and ran hospitals, orphanages, and schools in the main French cities. The confraternities of charity operated in almost all the parishes of the kingdom, creating a network of Christian solidarity that silently transformed society. Vincent contemplated these fruits with deep gratitude towards divine providence, but without personal complacency, for his humility led him to attribute all the merit to God and to his collaborators. The most touching aspect of Vincent's old age was his growing identification with Christ crucified. The physical pains he constantly suffered, far from embittering his character, made him increasingly gentle and compassionate. Those who visited him in Saint-Lazare during these last years were edified by his serenity and by the peace that radiated from his face, despite the evident suffering. Vincent had learned to unite his pains to those of the Passion of Christ, offering them for the conversion of sinners and for the good of all his works. This spirituality of the cross, lived without drama, but with authentic depth, was the distinguishing mark of his mature holiness. On September 27, 1660, after a long agony endured with exemplary patience, Saint Vincent de Paul gave his soul to God. His death was as serene as his life had been, surrounded by his spiritual children, with his gaze fixed on the crucifix, and with a smile of peace on his lips. The last words heard from Saint Vincent de Paul were an invocation, a plea of trust in divine mercy, a virtue he had preached and lived throughout his entire existence. News of his death spread rapidly through Paris and across France, causing a wave of deep emotion among the people, nobles and commoners, the rich and the poor, clergy and laity. All wanted to pay homage to the man who had truly been the father of the dispossessed. Saint Vincent's funeral was an awe-inspiring display, a testament to the profound love the Christian people held for him. His body was laid in state at the Church of St. Lazarus, where multitudes of people filed past for days, coming to bid farewell to the saint. The poor of Paris, in particular, mourned the loss of their protector and advocate for so many years. Numerous miracles began to occur immediately after his death, through the intercession of the man already enjoying heavenly glory. Recognizing St. Vincent's heroic sanctity and the extraordinary fruitfulness of his works, the Church soon initiated the process of beatification, culminating in his canonization on June 16, 1737. Under the pontificate of Clement XV, Saint Vincent de Paul had earned his crown of holiness, not through ecstatic visions or extraordinary displays, but through the heroic practice of Christian charity in all its forms, demonstrating that the surest path to evangelical perfection is loving service to the poor and those in need. Chapter 12. A Prayer to Saint Vincent de Paul. O glorious Saint Vincent de Paul, Father of the poor, and sublime model of Christian charity, you who knew human miseries in your own flesh and transformed suffering into a school of compassion, extend your paternal gaze upon us, who desire to follow in your footsteps on the path to holiness. From the celestial glory where you enjoy God's presence, intercede for all those who invoke your powerful patronage, especially for those dedicated to serving the most vulnerable. You who knew how to see the very face of Jesus Christ in every impoverished person, grant us the grace of a living faith that allows us to recognize the Lord in every suffering brother and sister. May our eyes learn to look with compassion on the sick, the abandoned elderly, the orphaned, the imprisoned, and all those who weep in loneliness. Help us to overcome the indifference of our hearts and to conquer the selfishness that prevents us from loving as Christ loves us. May your example inspire us to make our lives a continuous offering to the service of the gospel. Saint Vincent de Paul, master of charitable organization, teach us to unite the generosity of the heart with the wisdom of the mind. May we be effective in our works of mercy, not content with good intentions, but working with constancy and method for the good of our brothers and sisters. Grant us the grace to know how to collaborate humbly with others in common tasks, putting our gifts at the service of the common good and avoiding all personal vanity. May our charitable work always be an authentic expression of our love for God. O Saint of universal charity, who knew no borders in your love for those in need, help us to broaden our hearts to the dimensions of the heart of Christ. May we know how to love not only those who are close or sympathetic to us, but also strangers, those who are different. Those who may seem annoying or unpleasant, grant us the grace to forgive offenses, to return good for evil, to be instruments of reconciliation in a world divided by hatred and misunderstanding. May our charity be truly Catholic, that is, universal, like the love of God. Finally, Saint Vincent de Paul, obtain for us from divine mercy the grace to persevere in goodness until the last moment of our lives. May neither the years, nor illnesses, nor difficulties, nor apparent failures cause us to falter in our purpose to serve Christ in the poor. When our final hour arrives, assist us with your intercession so that we may deliver our souls to God with the same confidence and serenity with which you surrendered yours. May we merit to reunite with you in the heavenly homeland, where there will be no more tears or suffering, but only the eternal joy of contemplating God face to face, together with all our redeemed brothers and sisters. Amen. Saint Vincent de Paul, pray for us. Sacred Heart of Jesus, I trust in you.